Hi, everybody. I'm sorry we have some problem in the room, but the talk is going to start soon. Okay, excuse me, I'm alone today, so I have to be in the room and on Zoom at the same time. I'm just verifying that I see the same thing on Zoom and in the room. Yeah. Okay. I can so it's sharing the wrong screen. So, Okay. Share again. What's the best? Where do you see the presentation? No, it's not this one. It should be the first one. Try this one, the desktop. Okay, great. Okay, so it's the same on Zoom. So sorry for the delay. Actually, we use a computer in the room. Everything was okay at 11:29. And at 11:30, the computer stopped sharing the screen for unknown reason. What happened? I'm sorry. So we can start now. I won't explain it as every week. It's a hybrid mode, both in the room and on Zoom. And now let's start. The floor to introduce the talk.
Thank you. So Luke is a tropical ecologist working conservation of tropical rainforest. In particular, he contributes providing tools for sustainable management of tropical rainforest in face of anthropogenic changes. He uses bird communities as a model, a study model, but you will see that he also uses other animals. And he has been doing field work in tropical rainforest for about 20 years, I guess, something like that. He has a permanent position as a researcher at the in bio and genetic. He's also an affiliate staff at Glasgow University and the co-founding director of a non-governmental organization called Biodiversity Initiative. So.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. Sorry for the delay. Next time I'll remember to bring printed photographs and I'll pass them all out to you just in case this goes bad. Yeah, so as Huma was mentioning, I'm with CIBIO, Biopolis in Porto. It's very confusing. We have two different names. CIBIO is the institute and Biopolis is like the sort of financial organization that handles the money. So I'm very grateful for the collaboration between Biopolis and Montpellier for inviting me to give this talk, and likewise for Home for very, very generously giving me so much time of his, teaching me a ton about ants. He blew my mind several times about ant natural history yesterday, and to all of you for coming to watch my talk. You probably noticed I'm a native English speaker, so if I get a little too excited, just give me one of these and I'll try to slow down a little so you can understand. But this is a very exciting topic for me. It's very new. I don't know very much about it. I'll tell you about as much as I do know. So I do get excited because I'm talking about something that's very dear to my heart. I think is really important. So if I do start talking really fast, please let me know and I'll try to calm down, okay? Thanks so much. Right, so many different funding institutes that really helped us to raise the funds to do all this work. 10 years of work in Equatorial Guinea, and yeah, I guess 20 years of work total in tropical rainforest, which makes me feel quite old. And special thanks to everybody locally in Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea that helped us make this happen on the ground. Do a lot of capacity building work with those folks, and I'll mention that at least in passing in this talk. So I like to start my talks as broad as possible. And this isn't quite the universe, but it is the Earth. And this is a map of the heat map, where red is more species rich in the terrestrial biomes. So you can see things are concentrated across the equator, with big in the Amazon, in West Central Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And the African Rift Valley, of course. This is a Manga Bay map of the world's remaining tropical rainforest as they define it. And then you can overlay those to see that really the richness is in the tropical rainforests on Earth. So if you really want to conserve biodiversity, study big numbers of animals, the tropics is where it's at. Tropical rainforest is where it's at. Why? More than half of the Earth's biodiversity on just 7% of the land surface, according to E.O. Wilson. And about half of the closed canopy forests have already been cleared. So there's this urgency where tropical forests are being cleared very, very quickly. In fact, it's about 7 million hectares annually. That's about the size of Ireland. This number ebbs and flows depending on the president of Brazil and other things, but that it works out to about 1 football pitch every 4 seconds. So just since I've been talking, many dozens of hectares of tropical rainforests have disappeared, which is very sobering, and motivates a lot of the work that I do and that my group does. So why work in Africa? So when I started working on this project, I shouldn't walk in front of the screen. When I started working on this project, when I thought of human population growth, what I thought of was India and China, right? But the population of China stabilized this past year, and the population of India will stabilize in about another 2-3 decades, depending on the estimates. So really the population growth is coming in almost entirely from the continent of Africa. And depending on the estimates and contraception and various other things, we'll have 3 to 4 times more African people by the end of this century. So this will put an enormous amount of pressure on natural resources on the continent. And I would argue that us, Europeans, Americans, are probably driving deforestation in Africa through consumption of goods, wood, cocoa, oil palm, etc. But important to mention that one of the strongest, perhaps the strongest effect on human population growth is women's education. More education, women have children later, they have fewer children, and they concentrate more on their education and their careers. And so we focus quite a lot on capacity building, invest quite a lot on this. This is one of our students from the National University of Equatorial Guinea holding a very small Western olive sunbird, and lovely picture by photographer Tristan Spinsky. And just to keep going with the population growth thing, to really hammer it home, by the end of the century, 6 of the 11 most populous countries in the world will be in Africa. So Nigeria is going to rocket up to number 2 with close to 1 billion people. China is dropping precipitously. The DRC is shooting up to almost 300 million people. Angola will have more people than Brazil, which is completely mind-blowing for me. And so that's really going to change the demographics of the world and change the demographics of Africa and put enormous pressure on tropical forests, natural resources on the continent. So there's a big need. It's a real conservation hotspot and has really driven my sort of shift. When I did my PhD, I mostly worked in the Amazon. The Brazilians have fantastic biologists, fantastic conservationists. And it was very clear that shifting my efforts to Africa made a lot of sense. And so why, my background is in ornithology, and among other things, but I discovered during my PhD and subsequently that it's pretty clear that this group of understory birds, those that eat insects in particular, when you cut the forests, they're among the first groups that decline. And when you allow the forest to regrow, they're among the last to return. So they're pretty good indicators of rainforest health. And this kind of goes across regions. It's more or less pan-tropical. Take studies from rainforest in New Guinea, in Southeast Asia, and they show pretty consistent pattern, even though the birds aren't necessarily related to each other. So there's something about this guild that makes it a pretty good indicator. Although we know much, much, much less about this guild in Central Africa than anywhere else, maybe 100 times more studies in Panama, Costa Rica, Brazil versus in Central Africa. And so I will spend a little bit of time to focus on these bird pictures just to give you an idea of how cool the diversity is in Central Africa. So this is an African paradise flycatcher. It's a musicapid, and this is, like, if you believe it, a particularly boring one. It has this incredibly bright blue bill. Inside the mouth is this like impossibly bright yellow color, which we don't understand why it has that. This is a bristlebill, which is a type of green bull that's Pycnonotidae. There's hundreds of species in Africa, and it's very, very typical understory forest family. There's many, many species in the understory, and very often very difficult to identify. But this one has these nice bright yellow lures, and it's a common one at our site. Okay, so transitioning to ants, which Hum has been teaching me quite a lot about. These are Dorylus ants. There are many species of these, but I'm going to refer to them as driver ants, which basically means that they swarm in huge numbers across the rainforest floor, and they're a really important resource for birds and many, many other animals. And it's damn near get a good photograph or video of these things. So I really need you to use your imagination here to try to picture the impact of these things on the forest floor. So I was last in the field in January, and I was putting camera traps up all day long, totally exhausted, and I was racing home so I could basically take a bath before the sun went down. And I pulled into a huge swarm of these Dorylus driver ants. And this was the biggest one I've ever seen in my life by far. It was about 10 meters by 10 meters, where any place that I stepped my foot, there would be 200 to 300 ants in my footprint, right? So you can imagine the whole number of this living carpet of animals moving across the forest floor. So this is like the biggest known social insect colonies in the world. They get up to 10, maybe 20 million individuals. And so huge, huge, huge numbers for every square meter of the forest floor every few weeks, basically killing everything in their path. So they have a profound effect on the ecosystem, but they're really poorly known. The vast majority of studies of are anecdotal evidence of chimpanzees with their little dipsticks going into the nest and eating the larvae. But very little is known about ecology, how they work as keystone species, how they work as ecosystem providers, or the huge community of animals that rely on these. And why do they rely on them? Because this moving carpet of ants creates this front. And at the front, when you're there, all of a sudden, there is this buzzing and clicking noise that you can't quite place until you look down and you see that the entire arthropod community and the earthworms and the snakes and everything else is fleeing from this moving carpet of death. And I'm not exaggerating. So you can hear all the buzzing of the insects flying away from this mass, and you can literally watch them sort of fleeing in terror here. So that is a huge bounty for any insectivorous animal that's right at the edge of this front, because it's basically a free meal. So it's this sort of roving resource that is just providing a massive feast for whoever wants in, basically. So it's pretty important. And I know very little about the system. I got into the system through the birds, but it became quite clear to me early on that the ants are clearly the sun and the birds are the planets. And so to understand the planets, you really need the context of that sun. And so this is really the reason for my visit, to sort of share this with you, but also to work with whom and others to understand the ecology of the ants per se, so that we can understand the birds better. Now this is a close-up taken by Alex Wild that I found on Google, and you can see that they're pretty bitey. There's really no defense here, and this happens all the time because especially if you're walking at night, they raid at night, you just can't see that they happen to be there. Maybe you weren't paying attention, you didn't hear the fleeing sound of the insects. And so really the only way that you can deal with this is by stripping off your clothes and running away, trying not to scream too much, and then asking your field technicians please to pick the ants off you. And this has never happened to me ever. Now, the video works, amazing. Yeah, so it's a little grainy, but you can see that like in any 1 second on this log, which is probably the size of my leg, there's like 500 ants. And this went continuously for probably minutes. So if you just do some sort of your head, and what Hum tells me is a very small percentage, perhaps 5 to 10% are above ground in a raid at any time, you can get a kind of feel for the enormous numbers of these things that are roving about the forest floor. Okay, so transitioning a little bit to the birds. The birds are interesting because they set up shop along the edge of the front of these fleeing ants. And some of them, like this lovely Bledit syndactylus, it's a type of green bull, Pycnonotidae, they rely mostly or entirely on birds fleeing from the ants. So some of them literally don't feed themselves in any other way but getting food from the fleeing ants. And this is really interesting example of convergent evolution for me. So because the system exists in the neotropics as well, but neither the ants nor the birds are really related to each other at all. Hum and I were looking up the split in the ant groups, Eciton being the old world genus and Dorylus being the new world. And they're separated by something like 60 million years around the time that Gondwana still existed and the continents were connected. So they're very distantly related. So probably independently, the system of swarming ants and dependent birds evolved on the two different continents because there's sort of a niche for this guild. And there's all these sort of parallels in morphology, like this weird blue eye skin that for some reason these two birds in different families have, and various different types of eye ornamentation, which might be signaling to other species, showing dominance. We don't really know very well. Or maybe it's better to not have feathers on your face so the ants can't grab onto it. Pure speculation, but there's something going on here. And so the vast majority of the work, probably 95, 99% has been done in the neotropics by Susan Wilson, Joel Chavez Campos, and the unfortunately named E.O. Not E.O. Wilson. Actually fantastically productive and did a ton of work in the neotropics and a little bit of in Africa on the system. So you can see this would represent a raiding ant swarm of birds sort of perched right on the edge, looking for the insects that are trying to get away. And an interesting dominance hierarchy probably exists where the bigger, more aggressive birds get the good spot. So lots of interesting questions to ask and lots that we don't know about. These two beautiful characters here are two different thrush species. That's Turdidae. This thing is sort of like the European robin, sort of morphologically and behaviorally. Understory, pretty small and kind of sneaking about, trying to eat the fleeing insects without getting beat up by the larger birds. This is fire-crested Alethi, a very, very typical understory bird that can flash this very bright orange crest. Really cool animal. So a little bit about the questions that I'm going to try to tackle in this talk. The first, sensitive to rainforest disturbance, right? So I want to know, most of my questions are related to something about applied conservation. So this is sort of listed in the guidebooks, but never really been quantified. So we're trying to get at that in several ways. I'll walk you through it. Is their behavior specialized on Dorylus ants? So number one, do they check nests of the ants? And number two, do they listen to calls of heterospecific bird species. So in other words, if we play a call of this brown-chested aleph, the other species, will a different ant-following bird species respond? So that would make them pretty well specialized. And do they have large home ranges? This also has conservation implications, right? So basically, the bigger the home range is, the more complex it is to sort of protect, because you can't just protect a small piece. And you might think, okay, this is a bird, it can fly wherever it wants, but understory birds in the rainforest are a little bit more like mice or something like this. They tend to have very short wings, they fly short distances, something like a chicken or a pheasant. And a chicken is an understory rainforest bird from Southeast Asia, red jungle fowl. So we think it's a little like this. They use their wings more to sort of flap around, escape danger, but they don't typically fly long distances. A typical understory bird in the rainforest has a home range of maybe 10 hectares, maybe 5, relatively small for a bird. And they're residents. So I'll start on the first topic. So we think that because of this presumed sensitivity, at least in English, we have an expression, canary in the coal mine. And this comes from these coal miners who in the 19th century and before would bring a literal canary, which happens to be an African bird, in a little cage, so that when they go down into the mine, if the conditions are bad, if there's toxic fumes coming, the canary will start to fade and die if things are really bad. So I don't think it's a coincidence that a bird is used as an indicator of sort of health, ecosystem health. And we want to know sort of what are these canaries. So this is a map of remaining forest in tropical Africa here. You can see that West Africa has mostly been deforested. There's still a lot of vegetation there. Cacao, oil palm, coffee, and most of the Ivory Coast and Ghana are more or less functionally incredibly common animals that were previously there. These elephants, gorillas are largely extinct, gray parrots. But you can see that the second largest rainforest in the world, this sort of, I'm going to call it the Congo, also called Congo Basin or Lower Guinea Forest, is still largely intact. So it's a really kind of front-end approach to doing a lot of work there. And I worked quite a lot in Cameroon over the years, and we have long-term research going on mainland Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is consists of an island here, Bioko, and this mainland chunk here that's a couple 100 kilometers long. So I'll start with a study from Bioko Island from Biotropica a few years ago, where we wanted to know the effect of roads. They built, the Chinese cut this brand new road through a scientific reserve, which is the strictest category of IUCN reserve. And so we set up net lanes sort of right along the road, just inside the forest, and then 500 meters into the forest to sort of avoid that edge effect at 3 different elevations. I will just focus here on the, I'll touch on the high elevation stuff, but we didn't see very many patterns. Ant-following birds, a lot of overlap, nectivorous birds, same thing, insectivorous birds generally, mixed species flockers, not a lot of pattern at the mid and high elevation points. But down in the lowlands at 300 meters, we see a very strong pattern where ant-following birds in particular had almost twice the number of captures of birds in the forest relative to the roadside plot. So something's going on with this guild in particular, also generally insectivores, and another really cool guild called mixed species flockers, where dozens of species of the same flock will sort of hang out together, probably for defense from predators and looking for food, and roam the forest as a like mixed species group. So both of those guilds looking like they're particularly sensitive. It's typical that birds that eat nectar, grains, and fruits, they often have no response or actually do better when things are cut up. Because you can imagine if there's more sun, there's more primary productivity, more flowers, more nectar, more grains. And so it actually could be good for some of those guilds, but the insectivorous birds are much more sensitive as a general rule. Okay, so second study is from Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon. It's not quite a meta-analysis, but a study taking 10,000 bird captures over 30 years from various different sites. It was done by my now postdoc, Crinan Jarrett, who's at the Swiss Ornithological Institute. So she took a broad smattering across southern Cameroon, and this is continental Equatorial Guinea, sites in cacao plantations and mature forest and secondary forest. So she looked at these three habitats. You can see a full sun cocoa farm is really total monoculture, very little understory or overstory. The shade cocoa is sort of mimics a proper forest, and primary forest is sort of much more complex. This more or less has two layers. It has the understory and then an overstory, which can be really quite diverse. And they can actually just leave the rainforest trees there, kind of clear out the understory and plant cocoa underneath. So it can be pretty darn good for biodiversity. So I'll focus on the guild of interest first, the ant following birds. So this is basically capture rate. This is the rate. And we see that as you increase canopy cover, you don't really get close to the levels of the only ant following birds we really captured were when there was a big chunk of forest nearby, like the Ja Biosphere Reserve in southern Cameroon. And the other guilds had a sort of mixed response. Mixed species flocks don't quite get up to the level of forest either. The specialized forest birds, mostly insectivores, pretty similar response to the ant. Insectivores generally suffered, and but frugivores and nectivores had either a neutral or a positive response because of the primary productivity thing I mentioned and the increased sunlight. So second piece of evidence that ant followers are sensitive. So for this third study, we looked at mainland Equatorial Guinea, where we have the term study site in the yet to be dedicated new capital city called Ciudad de la Paz. So these yellow ones are existing protected areas, the green is forest, and the kind of red and black are roads and urban areas. So zooming in here to the new capital city where we do our work, we have a 100-hectare plot in secondary forest and a 100-hectare plot in primary forest. And these are, the secondary forest is quite good here. So it's closed canopy forest. The canopy is about the same height, on average 14, 15 meters as the primary forest. And the emergent trees are 27 meters tall, which is about the same as the primary. So to the untrained eye, in the middle of this plot, it's very difficult to tell that you're not in primary forest. But it is affected by roads on three sides. And there's a high voltage power lines right here where the vegetation's regularly cut, and it's maybe 30 meters wide. So it's effectively a forest fragment of 250, something like this. So we're looking to compare the bird communities in these two plots to see who these canaries in the coal mine are. So first we did this ordination plot that basically spreads the bird community into, spreads out various different axes of the bird community into two different axes. And what you see here is separation between the secondary forest signal and the primary forest signal. So that means that the communities are quite different. The birds, we can't necessarily tell that there's a difference there, but the birds clearly can based on what we see here. And this is complicated, so I'm going to break this down. This is like the species-specific response of each of the focal species that we had. Green is primary, blue is secondary. So I'll start at the top with the Platystera. That's the wattle eyes. This is a wattle eye, and it's a really understory bird. Perhaps 10 or 15 species in Africa. They're super unique. This is the wattle, which is, it's not bare eye skin, it's actually a separate flap that if you blow on the bird, which bird banders typically do, it sort of flaps. So it's like totally separate from the eye, like a separate piece of, and if you believe this is the female, the boring one, so that they're just magical. They have this really cool ring around the iris, which makes their eye look like a eclipsing sun or something. I've never seen that in any other bird. So they didn't show any significant difference, but I couldn't resist just blowing this picture up for you to show you that wattle eyes are really cool. Maybe with more captures, we'd get a stronger response on this species, the concreta. Okay, so second guild is terrestrial insectivores. This is one that, these are basically the miniature chickens of the rainforest. They walk around mostly on the forest floor, flipping leaves and this kind of thing. Mostly they're in the thrush family, but there are some Illidopsises, which is in the jungle babbler family, whole Eurasian family, and some African representative. 3 Illidopsis in the top corner there, they had pretty strong responses, and likewise these 2 kind of robin-like species, the Shepardia, and Shepardia in particular, we almost never captured it in the secondary forest. So these are probably pretty good canaries. Various of the mixed species flockers were pretty important. The Terpsiphone that I showed the picture of before showed a significant difference in various other and other sort of specialists that work together in these mixed group flocks were more common in the secondary forest, in the primary forest. And then the ant following species really led by these 2 in the bottom corner, the 2 Alethe species, the 2 kind of, they're closest analog in Europe is a blackbird, roughly that size, maybe a touch smaller, but a sort of similar guild, a little more understory. They were caught about twice as often forests as in the secondary forest. And overall, we had about 70% more captures in the primary forest per unit time. So much more volume of animals there. And we don't exactly know what the mechanism is. I'd like to dig into that a lot further, but clearly there's something going on where birds just aren't in the secondary forest as much. But the pattern is a little bit different than in Amazonia and in other parts of the neotropics. There, what you would get is like total disappearance of the ultra-sensitive species. They just disappear and there's 0 captures. But here, at least at our study site, we're getting just like broad reductions across the board where, what is this, 10 or 13 species, roughly half of them are you just getting less. So the pattern is kind of different. And there's probably a biogeographical reason for this, which I won't speculate on here, but you can. Okay, so second question, is their behavior specialized on Dorylus ants? So I'll walk through 2 different ways that we evaluated this. Mostly this is the work of my PhD student, Patty Rodriguez. So first she wanted to know, do they check Dorylus ants? Right, the Dorylus are pretty nomadic and they don't swarm every single day. So it makes sense to have a bunch of different ant colonies in your home range and check them regularly to see if it's dinner time, basically. So we put up a bunch of these 360 GoPro cameras. There's one here, nicely camouflaged in the corner. And we put them at ant nests. And the nests are underground and you can find them, well, by following the column back, and they usually have this sort of refuse pile that they dig out tunnels and they leave the dirt on the surface so you can sort of see that there's nothing there. So this looks like this. Oop. So there's an ant nest just underneath where the camera's set up, and this lovely brown-chested Alethe is there checking out whether the ants are swarming on that particular day, and is looking pretty relaxed about it. I don't think this one's probably not very hungry. So it turns out that they do this constantly, and many different species do it. Right now, Patty is going through these, it's really hundreds of hours of footage, which is a ton of information because they're 360 cameras. So you can put like a VR helmet on and sort of look around to see if there are birds checking the nest at any time. So it takes an absurd amount of time to process this footage. So if anybody knows of like AI that can go through video footage quickly and identify like changes, like a bird appearing, for example, please let me know, because we're struggling with this and we want to use this technique going forward. Surely somebody knows. So I'm asking around. So the conclusion thus far is that across the board, basically every single ant following species checks these nests constantly. We have thousands of records now of this nest checking behavior. So they're pretty specialized in behaviorally and focused on the Dorylus. So the second way she looked at specialization was through a playback experiment, which I like experimental ecology, although it's often super, super hard to do. So she started, this is whether birds in the community responded, whether they sung, came towards the playback. And this is the type of call vocalization that was broadcast. So we started with two basically negative controls. So just white noise, and second, a green pigeon, which isn't a falling bird at all. It's mostly frugivorous. It sounds like more or less. And you can see the response is really quite low. Low percentage of the community responded. So this is this here line horizontally is basically the baseline, negative control. And then we played the species of various different known ant followers. We got a really strong response kind of across the board. So this is the black is before the broadcast, and the two colored dots are after the broadcast. And basically almost every single iteration after the call showed a positive response. So the bird community generally is responding, and these are not counting the conspecific. In other words, they're all documenting birds that species coming towards the observer or vocalizing. So clearly they're responding, and they're responding heterospecifically, which is a pretty finely tuned, specialized behavior to respond to species that's not your own. So they're fairly specialized. And we did this for a bunch more, just showing these three for simplicity. Let's see. I think it wants me to tell you more about this graph because it is stuck. We were doing so well. I regret again not bringing my pictures. Let's see. Let's see. Something happened. Voila. Okay, so this is a chart that I just recently was sent by Patty. So she's done a network analysis with all of her observations at the front edge of the swarm, where she crept up to the ants, trying not to flush the birds, which is super hard to do, and understood the bird community that is present at these swarms. And so naturally the sun is the ants, but the biggest planet is the fire-crested Alethi castanea. It's present at 95% of these swarms, and it has the most centrality measures, and by any measure, it's right in the center of this network. So this is probably a critical species that a lot of the birds are tuning into to hear its song, which goes, it sings quite a lot when it's at the swarms in particular. So this is really the center of not quite the center of the universe, but the biggest planet. That's the best metaphor I can do. Okay, so third question, do they have large home ranges? And again, your typical understory bird, maybe 5, 10 hectares in tropical rainforest would be a typical size of a home range. We put out 16 of these tiny, tiny GPS tags, which are not cheap. And we got back a whole bunch of them, and 5 in January, which I was really psyched about. They stayed on for a whole year, and the birds flew around the forest. And then we took, much to the delight of the birds, we took these little tags off the backs of the birds and uploaded the data to see how they moved around. So I'll show you data from these 3 typical ant-following species. Okay, so we got, 8 of them back with data. And their home ranges are pretty big, average of 79 hectares. So that's a lot bigger than the 5 to 10 hectares that your typical understory bird has. And this is very conservative because at least 3 of the birds only had 11, 12, 15 points. So you would expect that would be much smaller. That's kind of these little ones here, like this purple one. So this is really quite a conservative estimate, probably well over 100 hectares, which if you're walking around on the rainforest floor is a huge area to cover. So what we presume is that probably dozens of ant colonies in their home range. Some are swarming on some days, some are not. And so they're having to fly around, check many nests, find the one that is providing the food, swarming, and ideally swarming big, and spend their time there. But and around them might also be queuing in on something that they know. So that it pays then to have a big home range and to cover a lot of ground. So for somebody that does a lot of mist netting, because they spend most of their day flying around at 1 meter or 2 meters above the forest floor, which is where the mist nets are. So you can capture and study these species, which is kind of nice. Okay, so this camera trap photo here of our closest living relative basically remind you of the point that if you understand well a critical part of the ecosystem, animals that provide ecosystem services, animals that are keystone species, animals that are sort of beaver-like and changing the structure of the forest floor or some of our other physical part of the environment, then you protect a lot of the other species. I mentioned that chimpanzees eat Dorylus larvae, and this image was taken just 200 meters from the new capital city, from the new university where we have our home base. It's the only university in the world where you can walk to primary tropical rainforest, which is pretty cool. And I mentioned the dipsticks. This is what that looks like. Very cute. We capture lots of other images on the cameras as well. I mean, this is this egregious, having nothing to do with birds or ants, but being pretty cool. This is a giant pangolin, which is really hard to get a picture of. They're super rare, really hunted. They get caught in snares, which are like probably millions in Equatorial Guinea alone of, you know, the traps with the loop. So very psyched to get this picture and know that they're on this landscape. Forest elephants are all over the landscape as well. And likewise, gorillas are present and they're breeding. They're critically endangered. All three of those, all the species I've shown you pictures of here are endangered or critically endangered. And I would argue that like a gorilla, a chimpanzee, and an elephant, they're not really very good sentinels. They're not great canaries because they're directly hunted. So they're not an honest signal of the health of the rainforest. The rainforest itself might be pretty healthy, functioning ecosystem, but not have gorillas. And so if you look at a gorilla as a sort of indicator species, I would say it's not an honest signal as looking at the ants or the ant-following birds. They are cool though. Okay, so on the conservation kick that I'm on here, I'm very happy to announce that we were able to work with Rainforest Trust to secure funding for a brand new national park. This is Parque Nacional de la Paz. Here, about 100,000 hectares, which is roughly the size of Paris, twice the size of New York City, and is contiguous with 2 other existing PAs. So we think this is probably, well, certainly big enough to support the ant and the bird communities that we studied, includes our study area, but probably also big enough to support populations of those megafauna as well. So I'm pretty psyched to start this project in the coming months and to have the sort of privilege of continuing to come back there and work with the locals and work with the fauna there because it's a lovely place. Okay, so take-home messages. What I want you to remember: are ant-following birds sensitive to rainforest disturbance? Yes, they are, probably because the ants are as well, and we're going to dig into that deeper with Home and with my postdoc who's starting on Tuesday, who is specialized in ants, much like the birds. Is their behavior specialized in Dorylus ants? Yes, it is. I showed you that they check nests constantly, and I showed you that they respond heterospecifically to broadcasts of calls. And do they have large home ranges? Yes, about, let's say, 10 times larger than your average understory bird. So that has clear conservation implications where they need big amounts of space that's relatively undisturbed. So there's many, many things directions I would like to take this. Many of them are based on ants and understanding the ecology of the ants. One is agent-based models. They're also called individual-based models. This is a kind of old version of a video game-like interpretation of this. And basically, we know that ants operate on a relatively few number of simple rules. So if you can program how their behavior works and do a pretty good job of predicting how they move about the landscape. In this case, they're going from their colony to a food source, leaving a chemical signal, and then they're coming back to the colony, right? And so I think I'd like to frame some of our research going forward onto understanding how to make this model real, to really be able to have it be predictive and to be a realistic representation of how animals move about in space, right? If you can understand how fast the ants move, how often they move their nests, what represent barriers for them, and similar questions for the birds, understand the system, do a really nice predictive model and use that to inform conservation decisions. Where do I put corridors? Where do I put buffers around the reserve? How big does the reserve have to be? And these kinds of questions. Okay, so this is the Dorylus queen. She is enormous. And with all due respect to whom, she's a total freak. She produces 500 million eggs in her lifetime, is the biggest insect in the world, or the biggest hemiptera in the world. Biggest hemiptera in the world. Biggest ant for sure. She's like 5 centimeters long, and the biggest difference between the worker and the mom in the insect kingdom. Of course, they're flightless, and probably this very much limits their ability to disperse across barriers. Just really impressive creatures all around. I haven't had the privilege of seeing one directly. This is a lovely picture from the lab from Daniel Cronauer. And I'd just like to kind of end this segment by saying that we have this expression in English that the lion is the king of the jungle, which whoever invented really had never stepped foot into a jungle because it doesn't make any sense at all. I would argue that she is a queen and she is a Dorylus ant. And there she is. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luke. So if you have questions.
For this talk, very interesting. I'd be interested in your first ideas why the birds and the ants are sensitive to forest disturbance, because it makes perfect sense to me that the frugivores would not be as sensitive with the forest succession, but I'd be interested about the ants and then subsequently the birds.
I can best speak to you from the bird perspective because I know the and we don't know the answer, but it might be like our best guess is that it's a death by 1,000 cuts. So, for example, if you look at, well, they have these understory birds have these enormous eyes. You know, they have probably spent millions of years evolved on a dark forest floor, looking for dark insects, and having big, sensitive eyes makes. If you're in that situation, so if things are bright, either your eyes might physically hurt, or it just might be something that feels wrong to anthropomorphize a little bit. So they might just completely avoid it. And the data suggests that oftentimes they do. Many rainforest birds, they just never exit into bright areas. So it could be light. It could be depletion of the food source, that being arthropods and the ants to sort of push the arthropods around and make them available. We think that's probably a big one. The ants probably have sensitivities in terms, well, the ants probably arguably don't have enough food if things get cut up, or they're sensitive to light or heat that comes along with the light as well. You know, many arthropods are very sensitive to temperature changes. So that could restrict their ability to move around, to disperse, to access different areas, to move their colonies, and various things like that. So that's just like a handful of the sort of hypotheses that need to be tested, but that's like a wide open question, the mechanism there. And I've sort of debated whether going down those avenues or other kind of broader, more applied questions. And ideally you do both, but I don't know the answer, but definitely in this case, the ants have everything to do with it.
I was wondering, so the ants, they don't change nets, so they go and come back to the same net, and they don't overexploit their. So you see, they were telling everything, so they don't move with the queen once they have overexploited some environment?
So they do move with the queen, but they don't do this predictably. Not in Africa tropics. So they could move the whole nest, you know, millions of ants, 20 million ants every day, if they choose, or they sometimes a colony will stay for 3 months in the same spot, and we don't really understand why. We know if a predator digs up a nest or if a human messes with it, they'll move it. But reasons beyond that probably relate to the depletion of food, but it's not clear. The neotropical system has a kind of different thing where it's really predictable phases, where they have 14 days where they stay put, and then they move constantly for 14 days, and then they go back. And the rating doesn't happen every day. It alternates with those phases. But these ones are less predictable or don't move.
Julien, you can ask your question.
Yes. Hi, Luke. Thank you for this talk. I have a question about the ranch. You said that it's larger compared to what is typically known for a typical industry tropical bird. But I presume this data on other birds are from the neotropics. For comparison, do you have data on the range of birds in African rainforest, but of a non-ant-eating bird?
Yeah, so most of the data are from the neotropics. A lot of them was from me idiotically running around the jungle with an antenna in the Amazon when I was a PhD student, way over ambitiously. So most of the data come from there, but the studies that, the most recent study that comes to mind is Bill Newmark's study, where he was in the mountains in Tanzania and Kenya there on the western side. And he had some thrushes that he put tags on, and they had home ranges in the 7, 8, 10, 12 hectare range. So they were a little bigger than the typical neotropical ones, but not close to this. And the neotropical ones are 50, 100 hectares and at the same scale as these Afrotropical ones, which kind of makes sense given the parallels in their ecology.
Okay.
One of the things that we like to do is use vast capture network with many dozens of mist nets that are georeferenced. So we want to sort of understand how they move around on our landscape using the mist net captures, perhaps integrating that with the GPS data. And so we could get a nice comparison with the non-ant following birds on our sites, which would be a little more direct.
So yeah, I have a question about this. I don't know anything about birds or ants for that. So I was wondering why these birds sing when they have found the like all the time, or because you could imagine, but maybe this is just a human like thought. If you find a good food source, you want to keep it for yourself. But so do they sing always, or do they particularly sing when they found these ants moving around and all the food? Or did it evolve, like is it there to attract conspecifics or other birds, or?
This is the second time that I got this awesome question, and the second time that I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer. It's a great question with sort of an evolutionary behavioral component tied into it. I can sort of wave my arms and come up with something that they're sharing information. They're excited that food is present and they're vocalizing. Maybe there's some territorial pieces in there where they're saying, okay, I'm here, I'm set up, sing, sing, sing. And that's keeping other birds away from them and their little spot at the front, but it's also giving other birds information that there is a front there. That's the best I can do. But if anybody else has an answer for that one, I really would like to know, because it's a great question.
Thanks. A bit related to that, actually, I just was wondering with your videos if you could actually observe, or maybe like let's say yourself observe this kind of feeding events. Do you observe like these birds finding on ants, and if there are many ones happening at the same time, it's just one single bird that found the spot and eat a lot, and how much? Just a bit curious about that.
Right. So there can be many individuals of a bunch of different species. Let's say 5 species and 20 individuals would be like a pretty big group at the edge of the edge of the front. In the neotropics, I think these groups get bigger, and the birds are less sensitive to humans approaching them. So you could, within reason, kind of sneak up and watch without flushing them. At this system, they're super, super sensitive. I don't know why the difference. And it makes it really hard to do it. And my PhD student is basically a ninja, and she can really sneak in there, and even with her like really incredible ability, she still flushes them. So it's really tough to observe directly. And we think that if we figure out a way to use the cameras, that can be a better way to do it, because you have to like anticipate where the swarm is going to be, leave the camera, you know what I mean, and then come back and evaluate the footage. But we think there's something there, but we don't quite have it down yet. But the direct observation, it's really hard. I think we're gonna buy. I have no idea how to translate this, but it's a ghillie suit, which is like this thing you use for hunting, where you're like covered with fake moss, and it like looks like you're just like a piece of vegetation. So we're gonna try that this year and see if we can sneak in a little better. But that might freak the birds out too, because then you're basically like a floating face in the rainforest. So I don't know, maybe some paint. We haven't got it down yet. It's hard though, really hard.
Following up on the question about why they call, I wonder if there is maybe a group advantage in being able to detect predators. And then an annex question, do they have alarm calls that they also respond to interspecifically and have the same response?
Yeah, so I would strongly suspect there's an advantage to watching for predators. We know this is true for the mixed species flocks. They're a little bit more mid-story. This has been sort of like systematically tested, at least in the neotropics, that it's probably for predatorial defense to have all those different eyes. And you're not necessarily competing in that case because it's different species, so there's less niche overlap. So I'm pretty sure that's operating in this system as well. Yes, they do definitely do alarm calls, which I have heard many times, the result of me being there. Yeah, I'm sure that's alerting their neighbors and everybody that's there. No, but that's a good idea. I think we would just conclude that they're scared of alarm calls. Yeah, there's like there's a bunch of species of accipiter, the small hawk that is close to the sparrowhawk that's here is an accipiter. So you well know that are in the understory there, and they definitely prey on small birds. So there's a real predation risk. We the accipiter in the net, like right next to a bird that was clearly trying to get in the net, or maybe the bird, very occasionally the bird would be injured, because they got at it. But yeah, there definitely is a risk under there.
We have another question online by Vaishnavi. You can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, that was a really great talk and I really enjoyed it. You've done some great work and I liked everything about your presentation. I have a question about the noise that we were talking about the ants make. So you say that they sort of make this noise as they move around the forest floor. And do you think the birds also use this noise to track? Like, is it loud enough that the birds can track or detect the presence of the ants, coming out and moving across the forest floor, apart from the visual daily inspection that they do from like place to place in the forest? Thanks.
Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it. So the noise is made by, I wasn't totally clear there. The noise is made by the insects that are fleeing, not necessarily the ants themselves. Well, they make a tiny little clicking noise in the dry season when they're walking on the leaves. But I would guess that noise is not a primary means for the birds to find the ants. mostly because most of my work has admittedly been in the dry season because that season kind of sucks in the rainforest. In the dry season, it's just much more obvious because the leaves are crunchy and they make noise. So when a grasshopper is jumping on them or a tarantula is running across, that makes a kind of sound, and that accumulates when there's many insects. But the wet season, you wouldn't get that nearly as much. I mean, you would still hear the buzz of the flies and other things that are escaping and the cockroaches that are flying away. But then you wouldn't have that noise in the leaf litter, and you would also have, it would be masked by the rainfall, which is constantly sort of making dripping noises, and that white noise sort of, it kind of cancels out the sound of those little sounds. So I think it wouldn't be a good strategy for a bird to rely primarily on by ear. And I mean, birds, for the most part, are very, very visual animals. They dedicate a lot of energy into making these big sensitive eyes, especially in the understory. So my would guess it's mostly visual cues that they're relying on, but also listening to each other rather than ants per se. That's my guess, but I don't know for sure. Maybe there's some chemical signals that I'm seeing some sort of recent talks and papers that birds can smell much more than we think. The like sort of conventional wisdom is that they can't smell and taste anything or hardly anything because they don't have that many receptors, but I think that's changing. But I don't know if that's at play here.
Right, thank you.
With the large territories they have, would elephant passes not constitute nice highways to do efficient prospection?
I think that would be lovely for them. Yeah. And it wouldn't surprise me if they follow the elephants themselves. We have some, I didn't show this because it's after my talk, but I cut this slide, but they do follow other mammals. There's some anecdotal reports in the literature that they follow they follow these things. These are sengis, which are like small insectivorous mammals. This is same genus as the Alethi that we have, but this is in East Africa. So there's all these reports of the birds following these little mammals around. So I don't see why they wouldn't follow elephants around and use the sort of corridors and bit of disturbance that the elephants use. Immediately at our study site, we don't have elephant evidence, but they're for that landscape. They're in the new park. They're in the area, and I mean, it's almost a blessing because elephants can be dangerous. So, but yeah, surely they have interactions with these birds, and that much like if you look in the fields in Montpellier or in Portugal where I live, it's very common for cattle egrets to set up right on the edge of cows, and they're basically the same mechanism play there. The cows are walking around, they're disturbing insects, and the cattle egrets are all around kind of eating the insects that are trying to escape from the cows. So I think the same thing applies to elephants. I would be shocked if it didn't. Good one.
Okay, so if there is no more question, we can end the
Thank you so much. If you have further questions, speculation, collaborate, you have